Welcome to Learning Photography with Duck. Here's your host, Duck.
All right, everybody. Thank you for putting up with that little bit of a glitch. I don't know what happened here. But then, of course, those of you who've been with me long enough understands that if it's going to happen to me, and it's going to happen during one of these sessions. So thank you for your patience. Once again, I am your host, Duck, and this is Learning Photography with Duck. And, of course, today's session is Lightroom. And what we got for you today is we're going to talk about color, using color tools within Lightroom to really enhance our images. Now, if you guys remember, a while back, I threw up a poll on Facebook asking people what kind of photography you're mostly interested in. And the one that won out above everything else was landscape photography and nature photography and that kind of stuff. So what I did is over the weekend, I went to a little local park where I know there's a lot of wildlife. And I spent about, roughly an hour out there just taking some shots for today's class. So hopefully you'll appreciate the image that I'll be using to illustrate the session. All right, so without further ado, let me go and first tell you what's coming up. This weekend, I'm supposed to be doing a beginner's workshop with Milford Photo, but there hasn't been a lot of activity on that, so I got a feeling that Jesse's going to be canceling that particular workshop. But what's more interesting is this one that's coming up on October 5th, which is I'm going to be doing a little bit of a deep dive into some of the photographic composition rules besides or beyond the rule of thirds. One thing that I find with a lot of beginners is that they are taught that rule of thirds, where you have the grid and you have to put your interest subject on one of those intersections. And then they kind of just say, take that and run with it, without really expanding on it or teaching that there are other rules beyond that rule of thirds. And there's also a lot of psychology when it comes to image composition. So if you're interested in really understanding composition a little bit better, you might want to consider signing up. And of course, you can sign up through Milford Photo and their meetup group. So hopefully we'll see you then. Okay. Let's flip this over.
I got a question for you.
Okay, sure.
It's a color space question.
Color space.
Color space.
All right.
Okay, on the camera itself, you have a choice of two different types of color space: SVGA and Adobe SVGA. Okay, that's great. But I'm shooting SVGA. Now in Lightroom, when I go into Lightroom, I don't see any reason to use Pro Photo SVGA because my camera's not giving it to Lightroom in the first place.
Because your camera's what?
Well, the SVGA space, color space,
yep,
is now is not as large as the Pro Photo SVGA color space, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so I'm not giving Lightroom all that color space to work with. I'm just giving it my SVGA color space.
Right.
Right. So when I'm in Lightroom and working in Lightroom and saving, there's no reason to save as the Pro Photo SVGA. Is there?
Okay.
Lightroom's not going to add a color space to it.
Well, if you're using RAW,
Yeah, I use it raw. Yeah, it's all raw.
Yeah, you got to realize that the color space is set by the raw profile, regardless of what the camera says and regardless of what Lightroom says.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so it's how because you got to realize that an image is comprised of 3 layered black and white images, and it's the interplay between those 3 that creates our color space. Okay, but what happens is when it's translated into a specific color space, it says, well, this color cannot fit, this round color does not fit into that square peg. All right, so I'm going to cut off parts of that circle in order to make it fit. All right, so you're losing data in order to make it fit. All right, but because you can always go back to that raw file, if you switch to a different profile that now has a circle where you can fit that in, it'll pull it from the raw file. Where you run into problems is if you edit an image and then you export that image to a specific color profile and then you want to upgrade it. That's where you run the problems. Now, one of the things that I found about color profiles is that there are a couple of standards, but they're not widely applied. All right, so we know sRGB is the standard for what we look at on our screens, and it literally defaults to 256, 16-bit color using the 256 shades of color, right, on each channel. So those are pretty much set for our screen. However, when it goes to print, we're using subtractive process rather than an additive process, which is our screen. So now we're switching to a whole new way of dealing with color because we're dealing with pigments. Okay, so now the computer has to say, okay, you have this color represented by these values. What does that correlate in a real world with printed inks? And that's where you get into things like printer profiles, right? And you're going to find that there are a lot of colors that we can see on a screen that can't be reproduced with pigments. It's just physically impossible, right? So they say, okay, well, the closest we can get is this color. So it reassigns colors and says, okay, this is very close to this one, so we'll just call it this for the printing, okay? And that's why, sometimes you'll get prints that are a little bit more muddy, a little bit more washed out, right? You'll get colors in the deep shadow areas that just go to black, or highlight colors that just don't have the subtleties, is because of the color space. So one of the things that professional photographers will do is they will understand what their final project's going to be. And they're going to work within a color space that is going to give them the most amount of flexibility in order to be able to export to these different outputs, right? So if you know that you're going to be printing on a high quality press, then you'll probably want to make sure that you work in a color space that has more range, and that would be something like ProPhoto, Adobe Pro, all right? Uh, um, but if all you're doing is printing to, kind of like a generic printer, or you're just exporting to view on the internet, then you really don't need to be working in that big space if you're not going to be using those colors. All right. So one of the things that you might want to do is take a look at the color profiles. There are charts. They look like this crazy color triangle, and it shows you what the range is of each one. And of course, you got to realize the smallest one is going to be sRGB. But if you want the color quality, you might want to make sure that you're working in like a ProPhoto or some other larger color profile, and then export down.
The shooting raw doesn't make any. Okay, because the shooting raw, it doesn't take effect until it gets into Lightroom.
Well, not even in Lightroom. It's when you export. It's what it's rendering to the screen. So if you're telling Lightroom, I want to work within the sRGB color space, what it's going to do is it's going to translate the raw file into a JPEG so you can see it and be able to edit it. But it's going to render it to that lower color space. All right. Now, here's a little bit of a caveat. Even if you are working in a larger color space, you may not see much of a difference on the screen, because your screen, unless you have a high-end, monitor, is going to render at sRGB. All right. You just have to understand, even though you can't see it, you're working with colors that are beyond what you can see, but will be printed. Okay? So it becomes very tricky when you're first starting off, because you have to kind of keep this in mind as you're working, that you're going to be printing to a larger space. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so what I have here for us today, I'm going to try. Let me try. Infinity. There we go. I'm going to try sharing my screen. And where are? It used to be you can pick a window. Now I think the latest version of Zoom got rid of that for some reason. Oh, you know what? Let me close that and let me try it like this. Share. Can everybody see my Lightroom?
Not yet, but it's coming in, I think.
Is it?
There it goes. Yep.
Okay.
That looks good.
Okay. All right. So the way this works with sharing, I can only see my window. I can't really see what you guys are seeing. So please, if something goes awry, if it locks up, somebody please shout out. I appreciate it. Okay. So I have two images here that I took over the weekend. And the first one is this dragonfly. And then the second one, this is actually a vertical panorama that I did. It's actually 3 shots. I was working with a 150 to 400 millimeter lens. So I didn't have a wide lens with me. So I couldn't quite get, I wanted to get a lot of detail. So I did this stacked as 3 images. All right. So we're going to go with this first one here, the dragonfly. And there's a couple things you need to understand first off, right? And the first thing is that, and I've said it before, that I tend to be rather lazy about certain parts of my photography, meaning that I don't want to invest a lot of energy and effort into it. I want to be able to get right to doing what I need to do, is capturing the images. So I have certain settings on my camera that pretty much never change. And the first thing that I do is the color space or the camera color space that my camera uses. I have not color space, but color profiles. There's the Canon landscape, Canon portrait, is a Canon shooter, and you people with Nikons and Olympuses and Sonys will have something similar. All right, and let's see, there's Canon neutral, Canon standard, and of course there's also the monochrome if you want to just shoot, black and gray. All right, so you can set a specific color profile, or you can even custom create one. You can say, I want to add a little bit of contrast, I want to add a little bit of saturation, whatever it is. You can program your cameras to do so. Okay. A lot of people will say, well, if I'm out shooting landscapes, I'm going to set my camera to Canon landscape mode. And then if they decide they're going to take portraits, they're going to go into the camera and they're going to set it to Canon portrait or Nikon portrait. I don't want to have to be thinking about all these things I need to change on my camera just because I decided that I'm going to go from landscaping to shooting a portrait. It's too much of a hassle. I have too many things to consider that adding one more thing that just doesn't make sense to me, I don't want to deal with it. All right. So I tend to keep it on something that's fairly neutral. Again, you have to understand that I'm shooting raw. So my raw capture is going to be whatever it is. All right. These colors profiles, the camera profiles, is how the camera is going to render the preview for me. And to be honest, when I'm out on the scene, I don't care how the camera thinks it should look. Because I know when I get back to the studio, I'm going to be giving these images my own edits the way I want to make it look. Okay? The same thing applies to my use of white balance. I tend to go between 2 different white balances. If I'm in the studio, I'm using flash, I'm going to set it to the flash white balance mode, simply because it's not for my benefit, but for my client's benefit. I want them to look at the preview and say, oh, that looks nice, rather than look at the preview and say, oh, why am I so blue? Or worse still, why am I so yellow? Okay? So I want to get it close for their benefit, not necessarily my benefit. Otherwise, my camera pretty much resides in shade white balance for shade. Because I know it's kind of in between that full daylight and shadow, and even with, tungsten and fluorescent, with the color cast, I could care less about what the camera does to those color casts because, again, I know what I'm going to be doing back in the studio. All right, so hopefully that kind of makes sense a little bit. All right, so now understanding that, when I imported these images into Lightroom, Lightroom doesn't know what I want to do with the images unless I tell Lightroom to do something specific. So when Lightroom brings these images in, it's going to say, okay, how do I render this? How do I show the preview of this image? Well, it just so happens that I have some information already coming off the camera. So it's going to take whatever the camera has assigned to that image, and it's going to render it for you. Okay? So hopefully that kind of sets the stage here. So now,
hey Jeff, it's me.
Yes.
Yeah, Jeff, it's Nancy. I don't have a question or a comment, but I was going to say that when I shoot on the Olympus and I use one of those, it imports it. I can't remember, it imports it as a JPEG.
I'm losing your audio.
When I import the Olympus,
yeah,
it doesn't import that JPEG file, raw file. And I think I don't know. Like I didn't know what to do about it.
Oh, okay.
So the pointer gets in raw.
Okay. If I'm understanding correctly, because you're kind of cutting out, I think the dog barking in the background kind of.
There's a little dog fight going on. Yes.
Oh, I think they're overpowering the microphone. You really cut out there for a second. But usually when you import a raw file into Lightroom, Lightroom's going to look at a couple of things. The one thing they're going to look at is what were your settings on your camera. All right, and it's going to default to those settings first. Then it's going to look at your import settings, all right, and say, okay, what are the import settings? And if any of the import settings override the camera settings, then you're going to see that.
Okay.
So if you're seeing that switch, it's probably because of your import settings are telling Lightroom to ignore that part of the camera setting and just concentrate on the import setting.
Okay, that makes sense because I've never played around with the import settings, but I'll check that out. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. All right. So now, if we look at this image, it looks rather gray and drab. Okay. And if anybody's ever had any experience being out in the field and just experiencing nature and all its wonder, and what catches your eye, it's not something that's gray and drab. There's usually something there that caught your attention. And in my case, what caught my attention was this dragonfly, which was blue against a kind of murky green pond. I was at one of the ponds. So it kept landing on this little dead leaf. And I just waited for it to land, and then I take a couple of shots. So, what I saw on that day was a very jewel blue dragonfly against a kind of greenish background. All right, but if we look at this image here, it's pretty bland. And the reason for that, there's a couple reasons. One, it's the light. The light was at midday, so it kind of washed out a lot of the colors that the camera sees. All right, because you got to understand that the camera is going to interpret what it sees differently than what our eyes do. All right. And secondly, I'm shooting in a rather bland color mode for the camera. I'm shooting in camera standard. So it kind of flattens the colors out to begin with, right? If anybody's ever shot video, it's like shooting D-Log where everything's kind of neutralized to this kind of mid-tone hue, right? It's the same process, right? And I do this on purpose because that's the way I like to work, right? I want to be able to go in with my edits and push the luminosity around the way I want, and I want to be able to push the colors the way I want, right? But the color information is there in the raw file, okay? So hopefully that kind of makes sense to you guys right now, all right? So what I'm seeing may be drab, but what I know is that there's color behind that drabness, right? And what I want to do as the editor is bring out those colors and the light the way I want, okay? All right, so we've kind of touched on the different aspects of color management within Lightroom. So hopefully this will kind of kick in and reinforce some of those past lessons, okay? And the first thing that I want you guys to look at is this right here, the camera neutral, all right, where it says profile camera neutral, all right, that's the color profile that's coming off my camera, okay? And that's what's giving it this kind of grayish look. Now, off to the right-hand side of that, you're going to see this little grid, right? And if you click on that, it's going to give you a lot of options. And they're not really presets, but you can kind of think of them as a preset if it'll make it easier for you, all right? So if you're familiar with presets like with Instagram, you just hover over a certain look, you click on it, and it applies that look to your image. All right. In this particular case, what it's doing is it's adjusting the interplay with your red, green, and blue channels, all right, which is going to make certain things pop forward and certain things not pop forward, depending on the camera profile that you assign to it. Now, aside from the camera profiles, there are also a bunch of Adobe profiles as well as Lightroom profiles that come preloaded with Lightroom. And if you wanted to, you can create your own profiles, all right? That's a little involved. I'm not going to get into creating your own profiles in this session, but just be aware that you can, okay? So right off the bat, we see a bunch of Adobe Raw Profiles, all right? And of course, they kind of sort of match the naming convention that you would find in your camera. Nikon may call it something a little bit different. Sony will call it something a little bit different. But oftentimes you'll find the same. Landscape is landscape. Portrait is portrait. You're going to find those across pretty much all camera manufacturers. All right. And you're going to see that with the Adobe Raw, they have here Adobe Portrait and Adobe Landscape. Okay. Adobe Neutral and Adobe Standard, all right, which are very similar, okay? And all this is doing is it's creating a little bit of vibrancy or saturation boost to very specific channels, depending on the preset. All right. And of course, we have my camera comes with 5 different ones. These are the ones here. Your camera will be different. All right. Like for example, my Canon doesn't have the black and white mode. I can't, shoot black and white, but some Sonys and some Olympuses can. So you'll see that here. And then below that are a bunch of presets. All right. They have these very unique names of Artistic 1, Artistic 2, Artistic 3, and so on, which is like woo-woo, You can't come up with anything fancier. Okay. And then you have black and white versions, modern versions, and vintage, which is kind of trying to mimic some vintage films. Who knows? But the nice thing about this is that it gives you a starting point. And that's what you have to understand about these color profiles, is that they are going to be a starting point. All right. Now, before I'm just going to cancel out of this. All right. Before you choose which camera profile you want to start off with, you should have a kind of an idea of where you want to go with your image. All right. And one of the things that I teach both with, photography and editing, is that, when you don't have a clear roadmap, one of the best ways to kind of get a grip of where you want to go is to try to figure out what you think is wrong with the image. Because once you identify what is wrong, what you feel is wrong with an image, then you know what to do to correct it, or at least what avenue to follow to correct it. So, for example, if you see an image that is too overexposed, and you identify that as a problem, then one of the first things you're going to do with your edit is to bring the exposure down. Makes sense, right? So in this particular image, the one thing that I've already identified is how drab the image looks. It definitely did not look that way when I took it. So I want to make sure that I bring some of that color back. And the one thing that I saw was that this was a much more vibrant blue dragonfly. Okay, so I want to bring the blue out of the dragonfly. And the other thing was that it was kind of like a murky green background. But because I understand color theory, and I know that blue and green, they're kind of side by side on the color wheel. All right, actually, here we go, color wheel. All right, we have, actually, you can't see my color wheel, can you? Because that's not, or can you? Can you see my color wheel?
You can see it on the side, but they're really small.
Oh, yeah, no, okay, all right. Yeah, that's the only, okay. So, on the color wheel, green and blue, they're not quite together. There's cyan in the middle of it, but they're close enough that they're not really opposites of each other. Okay, so in order to push them more into opposites, so I get a color contrast, I might want to take those greens and start pushing them more towards the yellows. That's going to give me a wider gap between the blue of the dragonfly and the green of the background in order to use color to really bring the subject forward. Okay, so those are my 2 goals right off the bat. Okay, make the dragonfly blue, make the background vibrant greenish, yellowish. A bright green, okay? The other thing that I notice is that I have a lot of, stuff on the side that, all this stuff here that's kind of distracting, all right? And even some of this stuff. So I might want to look at controlling that a little bit in the final rendition, all right? And finally, the other thing that I saw is that we have a diagonal going on. What you're seeing here, this part here is the water. This part here was a log. Okay, and what attracted me to this scene in the first place where there were turtles sunbathing, but as soon as they saw me, they scattered. All right, so I was in this place, and then this dragonfly, was dancing through, and I switched my attention to the dragonfly. But there's a log here, and there's water there. All right, so it creates that diagonal. But for me, I look at the diagonal of the log, all right, and then I look at the diagonal of the dragonfly. And for me, they seem like they're clashing a little bit. One of the things that I tell a lot of people is you want to have your horizons fairly straight, okay? If you're going to do what's called the Dutch angle, where this is where you take your horizon and you angle it, make sure it's a very clear, distinct angle so that the viewer understands that it was an angle made on purpose. Don't give it, 2, 3, even 5 degrees of an angle, because it's going to look like a mistake. But if you have a 10 to 15 degree angle, then it looks like it was done on purpose. Okay, so in this case, there is no horizon reference. But if we look at the dragonfly, it looks like it's precariously leaning at an angle. So I think, in my head, I'm thinking, I would like to see this angle be more horizontal. All right, so I'm going to play around with my cropping and angle this. I'm not sure yet. We'll see. Okay, so what's going to happen at that point is this angle here of the log is now going to be a little bit more exaggerated. Okay, but because it's very blurry in the background, I think it's going to work. Okay, so those are the things that I identified right off the bat with this particular image. Okay, so hopefully this is a trick that will help you out with your own images. Identify what you see wrong, and then we'll work to correcting those. Okay, all right. So we're going to go back to my camera profile, all right? And if you hover over each one, you're going to see that it applies that profile to the preview, okay? And, I am liking this one here, the Adobe Landscape. That looks pretty good, okay? This is actually getting a lot closer to what I saw when I took the shot, okay? Now, just looking at it here, I see this Adobe Vivid's very similar. But if we look at that, we can see that there's a little bit more contrast, especially in the shadow, and I'm losing some of the detail on the thorax and the dark parts of the wings. So I don't think Vivid is going to be any good. Now, if you want, you can always go through some of these, but these are really throwing some weird color casts. purples and such. But play around with them and try to get used to them. Ooh, that's kind of nice too. Again, we're losing some contrast. Okay, I'm liking that landscape one, so I'm gonna pick that. Come on, catch up. There we go. And I'm gonna go ahead and close. Okay, so right off the bat, just with that one little adjustment, look how much better that image is. Okay, now it's starting to come a lot closer to what I kind of imagined it in my head. All right, but I still got a lot of changes to make to this. Okay, now the other way that you can control color is with your white balance. Now, a lot of people kind of get hung up on this white balance thing, and they think, well, because I'm shooting in the daylight, it's got to be set to daylight white balance. If I'm shooting with flash, it's got to be set to flash white balance. And one thing I tell people is don't get locked into that kind of mentality. All right. White balance is just a color correction to whatever the light condition is. You can override it depending on the mood that you want to give to your image. So if you want something that feels friendly, you're going to want to go to something that's a little bit warmer. If you want something that's a little bit more standoffish, all right, where you want to create a little bit of distance between the subject and the viewer, then maybe, a cooler tone is more appropriate, right? Base it on the subject, base it on the mood that you want to portray to your viewer, okay? So in this case, it's an outdoor scene. So I know that I want to kind of make it, a little bit outside. All right. So if we look at the slider, we see that the temperature goes from blue on the left to yellow on the right, which makes it easy. Now, I don't want to go too warm because I don't want to lose the blue of the dragonfly. All right. So I also don't want to change that green into this kind of like bluish green color, because again, my plan is to take that green and really warm it up. All right. So in this particular case, I want to find something that rides in between these two. All right. Something that doesn't cool off my background too much, and something that doesn't warm up my subject too much. All right. So somewhere around at 43, actually 4,500 looks pretty good. All right. And if you go to where the numbers end, you can actually type in a number. Okay. The tint is more for color casts. All right. You can remove certain color casts. All right. And if you look at the slider, it goes from green to magenta. All right. So if we add a little bit of green, right, we can see that it kind of makes the wings of the dragonfly a little bit more cyanish. Okay, I don't want to go too crazy with that, but if we go to the other side, then it starts making that log in the background look more pink. I don't want to do that. So I might want to keep that, somewhere neutral. Right. And I'm just going to type in 0 there and take it from there. Okay. So now we're getting someplace, okay? And I'm going to stay within this basic here for a second, all right? Because one of the things that I do to all my images, all right, is I tend to add a little bit of texture and clarity because it appeals to me. And I also tend to pump up the vibrancy of the colors. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in, all right? And I'm looking at the texture of the dragonfly. I don't care about the background. The background's already been softened up by the short focal length on my lens, okay? But I do want to bring out some of the texture of the dragonfly, all right? And I'm going to drop my clarity, all right? Notice that it's, I don't know if you guys can notice this with the grain, all right, of the background. Still retaining enough detail on the dragonfly, but I'm losing some of that grain. So I think going to a negative on the clarity is going to work in my favor. Okay. All right, so let's just make it -20. I like round numbers. I don't know about you. Okay. Dehaze. It wasn't really a hazy day. All right. But, you know, you can see if the dehaze and it makes that dragonfly pop forward. So maybe, again, it's kind of experimental. All right. And then the last thing I do here is I like a little bit of that. I'm not colorblind, but I have a color deficiency in the pastel green and pastel red ranges. So for my eyes, what looks good to me is something that has a little bit more saturation. All right. So why am I using vibrance then instead of saturation? Well, the one thing you have to understand is what is the difference between saturation and vibrance, right? Saturation, we all know that saturation just boosts the color properties, makes them more vivid, makes them, brings the color out, makes them stronger, right? Saturation will give you that color contrast across the board from your lightest lights to your darkest shadows, okay? Which is, kind of what we want. But if there's a color in your image that already has a lot of saturation, it's going to push that as well. So it's very linear as to how it pushes colors up. Okay? So if you have muted colors, it's going to pump up the saturation of those colors. But if you have something that's already saturated, it's going to pump it up as well, and it's going to push it into the oversaturation level. And that tends to be kind of bad, right? And in this case, we don't have a lot of overly saturated colors, but there's, some vibrance already in some of the greens and some of the blue of the dragonfly, and I don't want to really blow that out, especially this early in my color editing, right? Because I know I'm going to be doing other things. If I push the saturation to a point that later on just kind of crosses that threshold, it's just going to make my image look terrible. So I don't want to push it too far just yet this early in my edit. All right. However, vibrance works slightly different. Vibrance kind of targets the pixels that are not saturated. All right. And it leaves any pixels that are already saturated with color alone. So there's a little threshold that says, okay, anything below this threshold, I'm going to boost the saturation. Anything above this threshold, I'm not going to touch. So for me, this more of a localized saturation of color works better for me. Okay. So hopefully that explanation kind of helps you understand the difference between the two. All right. And if you want to understand saturation the way the dehaze slider does, is it kind of works along the same principles, but the dehaze takes all the really unsaturated image pixels, right, and boosts the contrast and saturation up to remove that kind of like white cast. Okay, that's all it does. So it works at a much lower level than the vibrance. Right. Okay, so right now we can see if I toggle from my before image. Let me get out of. Okay, if I toggle my before image, you can see that my before image is almost a black and white image. But just those slight modifications, already we're seeing a lot of life being brought back into this photograph. Okay? So you can see, I know I'm doing a lot of talking, but in actuality, I've made very few physical changes to this image. All right? Okay, so hopefully you can see the benefits, all right? Now, at this point, all right, we basically just stayed with the basic panel, all right? The profile and some of the texture and presence and white balance. Everything is within here, all right? Actually, my just to bring out some of the detail in those, but I just want to make sure that I don't lose any detail in the black part of the wings and the thorax of the dragonfly. Okay? All right, so at this point, I usually skip all the way down to the bottom. And that is our calibration. Calibration. All right. Calibration is an awesome way of really manipulating colors within your image. But you have to understand that the calibration sliders will target individual color channels. Okay, so let me pause here and explain. When we're dealing with color, with photography, what we are manipulating is the differences between one shade of gray in the blue channel and the matching shades of gray in the red channel and the matching shades of gray in the green channel. Okay, so you may have the same pixel position in all three channels, but they will all have three different shades of gray. And that difference, when calculated, is going to give you a color. All right, that's the basis of color photography in a digital space. When we manipulate, let's say, something that doesn't reside within a channel, let's say yellow, okay? We don't have a yellow channel. We have blue, we have green, and we have red. All right. So in order to manipulate yellow, all right, we have to manipulate the differences between the red and the green channel in relation to the blue. All right, it doesn't touch the blue, it just modifies the red and the green. All right, because the opposite of yellow is blue. So if we want to manipulate yellow, we're going to manipulate anything that is not blue. Make sense? All right, which leaves us with the red and green channels. Likewise, if we want to use magenta, okay, the opposite of magenta is green. So if we want to manipulate the magenta colors, we're going to manipulate the blue and the red channels. All right. Now, I know this kind of gets confusing, but if you can remember RGB for your RGB channel, all right, and CMY for your print, all right. So you have your RGB for screen, CMY for print, all right. They tend to be opposite of each other in the color scale, in the color palette. Okay, the opposite of red is cyan, or cyan. The opposite of green is magenta, and the opposite of blue is yellow. All right, if you can remember that correlation, it will help you wrap your head around color theory in digital photography. Okay, so if we want to manipulate a color that is not represented by red, green, or blue, we are manipulating the opposite two channels to what it is. Okay. However, when we go down to the calibration, we are making changes specifically to those channels. And a very slight tweak to these settings can really, really enhance your image. Okay. So for example, with this one, I said that I wanted to make my blues a little bluer and my greens a little brighter, leaning more towards the yellow. Okay. So guess what? I'm very lucky because those are two of the channels that are available to me. Okay. So I'm not going to touch the hue of my blue. All right. I don't want to change my blue to anything other than blue. Okay. But if you move that lighter, you're going to see that you get a contrast. Okay. And it's not a major shift. You're moving to, negative 100 and positive 100. Drastic changes. All right. Give my computer a second to catch up here with you guys. Okay. However, if I boost the saturation, what it's going to do is it's going to up the saturation of that blue color, all right, and just a bit of a blue touch, and add some vibrance to that dragonfly. All right, and is my screen bouncing around on you guys, or is it just on my end?
I don't think it's bouncing around.
Okay, good. All right, because I'm looking at my little group screen, and it's like bouncing all over the place. I just want to make sure you guys are getting the good video. Okay. All right. So just blue, some vibrancy. Now, you're going to ask yourself here, okay, Doc, you said that the blue is targeting just the blue channel, but I'm seeing some changes in that green channel. All right. Why is that? I thought you said it wasn't going to touch the green channel. Well, it doesn't. But you have to understand that they're all interrelated. Okay. The way we get colors is the not multiplication, but the difference between the three values. So when you change one value, you are altering the perception according to the other two values. Okay, because we're dealing with up to 256 shades of gray on the red, 256 shades of gray on the green, and 256 shades of gray on the blue. All right. You make a change in any one of those, it's going to affect the other colors. All right. But when we think about it, the greens that we look at, actually, you know what? Let me take a step back. The colors that we look at, it doesn't matter if they're green, they're red, they're blue, they're pink, they're purple. They tend to fall into one of two categories: a warm color or a cool color. The only ones that fall into a neutral will be grays. Okay? So when we look at a color, you know, we can say, ooh, that's a cool red. All right, like think of a maroon color. Okay, maroon is a red. All right, but it's red that looks like it has blue added to it, so we consider maroon to be a cool color. But if we look at like a cherry red tends to be a very vibrant, very warm color, because when we mix it with, you know, paints, we're adding a little bit of yellow to it to increase that vibrancy. Okay? It's the same thing with greens. All right? You look at an evergreen, it's got that bluish green color in comparison to, you know, something like a mint color that is more of that really true green, and to grass, which is a lot brighter, that has a little bit more yellow in it. All right, so we have to understand that there's all these interrelations. Okay, so when I move this blue slider and see that change in blue green color, okay, saturation with the blue, it's making that green in the background look a little bit more saturated as well. Okay, and if I add a little bit of saturation, green, well, it's really doing a lot. That the green channel is not having as much an effect on that green background that I would like. Okay, I change the hue. So I move the hue. Right? I change it, goes to cyan. I change it yellow. Earlier, when we started, I wanted to push the green closer to yellow, which brings it furthest from my blue. That's going to give me that nice contrast. So if I bring that green hue down, and look, I'm pushing it all the way to -100. Look what it did to that green background. It really, really made it much brighter. And now, that blue dragonfly, right, popping out. Actually, if I hue, okay. So let me warn you right now. The reason this is working so well is because the color palette of this image is being restricted to pretty much two colors, green and blue. You're going to get different results if you have something that has other colors in it, okay? And, you know, we'll get into that on the next image. But right now, it's really working in my favor, okay? Now, I'm starting to pick up a little bit of a green cast here and here. I'm not really opposed to it. It's not that bad, okay? And then I might bring that log in the background, all right? So all of this, okay, I don't want that coming forward, and I don't want it competing with the dragonfly, okay? And I don't want to play with this because I find really dumb stuff. So I can leave this part alone, okay? All right, so now you can see how I kind of jumped from the beginning of the stack in Lightroom all the way down to the bottom of the stack here on the right hand side, okay? And already my image is looking closer to how I perceived it, okay? All right, but we still got a few more things, all right? We're going to jump back up to tone curve. I'm going to probably add a little bit of a and I don't want to lose too much detail in the dark here, okay? And we have all these distracting highlights. I don't want to push them up. However, I like to prefer things that are a little bit contrasty, okay? Salt and pepper to taste when it comes to this, okay? Salt and pepper to taste. All right. And I think that's pretty much it for the tone curve. All right, the last one I'm going to touch on with this image is the hue, saturation, and luminosity sliders. I think for this image, they're really, really going to help me out a lot, okay? Now, the one thing you're going to notice right off the bat is that there are more choices than your CMYK RGB choices, all right? We have, we have red, we have green, and we have blue, which are RGB. We have yellow. We don't have cyan, but we do have aqua, and we have magenta. But in between those, we have orange and purple, okay? The one thing that you have to understand is that these sliders are designed to target specific areas of most typical subjects that you photograph, all right? And the one thing that you'll come to find out is that this orange slider works really, really well with portraits, all right? And the purple slider works really, really well with some landscapes, okay? Even though they're not part of your typical RGB CMY profile, okay? All right, in this case, what I want to do is I want to shift my greens a little bit more to the yellow side. So I'm going to go to my hue, All right. Now you have hue, you have saturation, and you have luminance. Okay, up here. So you can click on these tabs, and it's going to give you the same color choices, but they're going to target 3 different things. All right. Or you can come on all the way to the end, and it says all, and it's just going to expand the panel to include all, and then you'll have hue, saturation, and luminance all in one panel. It all depends on how you like to work. Me, I prefer working one tab at a time, but that's my preference. You work accordingly, all right? So what I want to do is I want to bring this green a little bit to the yellow side. So how can we do this? Well, we have our green slider. Right? But I earlier said that there's a lot of blue in some greens. All right. If a green is considered a cool color, it's going to have blue influencing it. If a green is on the warm side, it's going to have yellow influencing that. Okay. So now that we understand that, what do I want to do with my green? I want to have it more yellow. So I'm going to take and I'm going to touch the blue, because even though there's blue in the green, there's also a lot more blue in my dragonfly. All right, so I'm not going to use my blue to affect the green, even though it will. All right, I want to look at it's definitely going more to color. Okay, let me zoom in. Okay, so now it's looking a lot better. The other way, all right, I'm just going to zero this out, zero it out by double clicking on the title here, on the little header. Okay. The other way you can do it is that there is this little icon right here, a little target icon. If I click on that, it's going to change my cursor as I hover over. It's going to change my cursor to a little crosshair. So I can target very specific colors of my scene. All right. Am I locked up? I hope I'm not locked up. Okay. Let me know if I'm locked up. Otherwise, I'll just keep going. All right. So I can take and click on it. As soon as I either these greens, we have this spot here. I can and then of course I can go here to the purple in there. All right, but So now we're getting some real color being pulled out of this image. All right, and that's just with the hue. The next tab over is saturation. All right, how saturated do you want to make these? Well, I want to give a little bit of saturation to and maybe no much. Okay, so I'm hovering over it, and if I drop down, now, okay. You can buy your all right, and I think it's much better. Now, the last tab is luminance. How bright a particular color is. All right. So in this case, the dragonfly really popped forward, and it's kind of pushing that background even further back. Okay. But there's also some detail here that I want to bring forward. So maybe and I want to all right. So you can see you can actually target very, very specific parts of your image. Just keep in mind that these are global changes, and you have to be aware of that. In this case, I have a very simple composition. But if you have an image that has a more complex composition, pay attention to what's happening outside of your target area. Okay? Just a little note. All right, and I'm pretty much done. I'll click on done. I'm pretty much done with the hue, saturation, and color. All right. The last part of color grading is the color grading panel. Okay. I am pretty happy with this. All right. I don't think it needs anything else, especially because I understand how this particular panel works. What this panel does is it targets areas of luminosity and it tints those areas with a color grade. All right. This is more for creating that kind of like cinematic feel where there's a very dominant color overlay over your entire image. Okay. In this case, there's a lot of highlights in the green, but also a lot of highlights in the blue of the dragonfly. If I apply a color overlay over my highlights, it's going to affect both areas, both the green and the blue, which is kind of going to be counter to what I actually want to happen here. I'm pushing the dragonfly to the blue, and I'm pushing the background to the green. I don't want to cross-contaminate those areas. So that's why I'm just going to skip this one. All right, but hopefully you now understand why I am skipping it. All right. The last thing I'm going to do for this particular edit is I'm going to go to my detail, and I'm going to add a little bit of noise. and just to bring down grain down. I don't have to kill a lot of the detail in the dragonfly. Make sense? All right. So now let's look at the before. That's what I started off with, guys. A very bland image. And this is where we ended up. Okay? All right. The last thing that was on my little checklist of things to correct was the angles. All right, so I'm going to go to my crop tool. Go here to my crop. All right, and I'm going to play around with this a little bit until I find something that I feel works. All right, and remember I mentioned that I wanted to see if it would look better if the dragonfly was a little bit more. Right? And actually, if I go, actually way too much, right? Let me turn myself off. Oh, actually, you guys didn't see it. All right, up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the navigator. The navigator is giving me a preview of what it looks like with the crop. All right, you can see that's pretty tight. And that background angle, yeah, I don't know. I'm not too sold on the extreme angle. All right. So my initial idea, now that I'm actually physically seeing it, doesn't work. All right, come back, bring this back, merge it up. All right. I'll give it a little bit. Oh, then need to like dragonfly, yeah, 2/3 in, and give it some open space behind. Okay, and that doesn't look too bad. Okay, the only thing that kind of sort of bothers me, although it may not be too bad, is this right here. All right, and I think I'm just going to create a linear gradient. But I'm just going to go ahead and go to my highlights. All right, and let me expand this down. Okay, and my and and if I toggle that on and off, it doesn't seem to have done too. Oh, my computer's slow. It's grinding away. There we go. There you go. That's before, and that's still a little slow. That's after. All right. I think I'll bring it's a little bit.
Maybe.
I could. I don't want to kill the greens too much because they kind of, you know. Cool it off a little bit. Cool it into that background.
Oh yeah.
All right, because that blue that you're seeing it's actually a log back there, and the log was brown. All right, so I have to understand what my base color was in the original. All right, even though I did into the scene. All right, that's an artificial green. Okay, that my original color was brown. So now by cooling down, we're bringing that brown back up, and it's really making it look kind of ugly. So I say that. Yeah, so that's about it. Right, but I did tone it down a lot to previously. Okay, so now by changing the angle, obviously we also were able to crop in. But because I'm working with a rather large file to begin with, you know, I still have plenty of image space. I still have 3,700 pixels across. All right, and that's because of the high resolution of my camera. All right, so this number right here that you're seeing, this is my cropped size. So after that crop, you can do a quick check. All right, now, and if you don't see this, all you got to do is hit the letter I on your keyboard, and it's going to toggle for that little information, 3 lines of information, and you can determine what kind of information you want to present. All right, I like knowing what my crop factor is. All right, just so I make sure that I'm not cropping too small that I won't be able to make good prints from. Okay, all right. So now we have a much tighter composition. Okay, and once you get to this stage, the only thing left is really just minor fine tuning. You know, maybe okay. Actually, that works. I kind of like that. So we have this nice detail. Okay. All right. So that is our before, and this is our after. What do you think? Any questions? All right. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing here and open it up for questions. And my screen is hung up, isn't it? Yes, it is.
Can you say again about the I can't remember what it's called. I'm looking. The color grading. When you would use that versus when not to use that.
The color grading panel. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so everything within these panels are going to create global changes, meaning it's going to apply everything across the board, no matter what the subject is. It's going to apply to everything. Okay. So what this does is it targets 3 areas of luminosity in your image. Right. So anything that is bright, so luminosity that is, highlights, brights, okay? Like we have this little, actually, let me go back to share. All right. These little bits of highlight here, on the wings, on the thorax here, these little highlights here, okay? These little highlights. It's going to affect all of those. It might even affect some of this a little less because we're starting to get closer to our middle gray. All right, so, but it'll affect some of these, all this area down here. This is all very bright, all right? This is getting closer to that middle gray, so it's going to affect it a little less. But what it's going to do is it's going to apply a color to those areas. All right, so let me show you what that means. Okay, I'm going to go to my highlights. All right, and I'm going to say I want to add. Let me add something. Notice how the all those little bright areas now have a red cast.
Yeah.
Okay, but if we look in this upper triangle here, this triangle here, all right, still looks green. Okay, this area still kind of looks that reddish brown. This area here still has that blue influence. Okay, because and even this leaf here still looks green. It doesn't have a red cast because those are more in the middle, the midtones and in the shadows. All right, so they're further away from the highlights, right? So we can apply a color cast to these distinct areas, all right? And this is, like I mentioned earlier, this is where you get that kind of the Hollywood cinematic look, all right? And we have overall look towards the mood that you want to represent, okay? And the typical cinematic duality, I guess you can call it, is blue and orange, or no, I'm sorry, blue and yellow. Okay, blue and yellow, because they're contrasting colors opposite of each other, or the green magenta or the green orange is typically what it's used. All right, so that green orange contrast, because orange it makes a lot of the skin tones a little bit more richer, not so drab looking. Okay, and the green is used in the shadows to kind of lift them out of that deep, dark, kind of depressing blackness. Okay, so those are the two kind of standard color grades. Let's see, in this particular case, adding that duality does not work. All right, because we've lost, by adding green into the shadows, we've lost our blue that we worked so hard to accomplish. Okay, and the only thing it really did is in the highlights, we gained a little bit of green, but we lost it in the dragonfly. So that's why I said for this particular case, it doesn't work. Okay, so I'm going to take it off. All right, but there are cases where color grading an image in that respect really, really works. Okay. Oh, did that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, I play around with it and I'm trying to figure out that.
Yeah. It's definitely, it's definitely for something that you want that kind of like Hollywood cinema feel to it. If you want something with a lot of drama, that works really, really well. But the subject has to, really present that drama as well.
Yeah.
This dragonfly, not very dramatic. It's nice to look at. It's not. It suffers from that dramatic Hollywood influence. So, okay. All right. All right. Any other questions? It ran a little longer than I thought. I was gonna see if we can get into this image. You know what? I've already done this, so let me see if I can show you what. Let's see. Add a green. So, okay. Is it going to allow me to? Oh, it's not going to let me. Okay. Doesn't let me show you before and after with the virtual copy. Okay, that's kind of weird. All right, let's turn that off. And yeah, no, it's not. Okay. Okay, so I guess I'll show it one at a time. Let me go back to sharing. All right, this is the original image. All right, you can see that the greens look kind of drab. The brickwork, and the steeple, it kind of stands out against the darkness, but this is using luminosity to separate the subject from its background, all right? And of course, we see that we have a contrast between the sky and the tree line, so we lost a lot of detail up in the clouds, all right? So what I've done is I've darkened that sky up a little bit. Actually, I've darkened that sky up a lot. Okay, I created some contrast between the highlights and shadows of the trees. I brought the saturation levels up. I kept that cool green color in the background because I thought that still played really nicely against, the warmer tones of the church steeple. But I brightened the red of the bricks, right? And also I brightened that foreground tree in order to create that foreground, middle ground, background separation. Okay? So it's very minor, and it's basically mostly done using color to create the separations. Obviously, the only places that I boosted the luminosity was in the sky. I created luminosity contrast in the trees and a little bit of brightening of that foreground tree. Okay? And we get from that to this. All right? Everybody see the difference between the two? Okay, came across okay?
Yeah.
All right. Now, a lot of people say, well, my camera, this is the way my camera captured it. I don't want to go ahead and stray too far from that because that's what my camera saw. That's the reality of the thing. So that's what I'm going to present. But, you have to put your philosophy into it. My philosophy is, yes, that may be the reality of what the camera sees, but it's not the reality of the mood or the emotion that I felt when I captured it, right? And that's also not the mood or the emotion that I want to convey to somebody looking at this image, all right? I don't want somebody looking at the image and going, yeah, it's all right, it's boring. Nothing's really jumping out at me, okay? When I can very easily do a few little changes and make it go, oh, wow, it's still, not the greatest subject, okay? But at least now it has some kind of interest, color-wise. It has a little punch to it, okay? So hopefully you can take some of these lessons and incorporate it into your own photography, into your own, especially, you know, landscapes. Landscapes tend to look a little bit muddied and a little bit flat. So you can see how just manipulating the colors a little bit can really bring those out. Now, the reason I say that is because we're starting to get cooler weather, and that means pretty soon the leaves are going to be changing on the trees. So if you're like the type of landscape photographer that likes going out and capturing the color change of the trees, these lessons will play heavily into how you show those changing colors. Okay, especially if you have a lot of yellows, oranges, and reds all blended together. They kind of tend to all mishmash together. By being able to go in and pulling out those individual colors to create localized color contrast will make those images really pop out. Okay, so keep these lessons in mind when you edit those fall color images. You'll see a big difference. Okay. All right. Let me go back to my chat. All right, guys. That's pretty much it for this evening's lesson. Hopefully you gained something from it. And as always, if you have any questions, you know, go ahead and ask them now. But if not, if you know, either rewatch this or later on you're working on your own image and you say, oh, you know, what was that? You can always hit me up on Facebook or email me directly, and I'll be more than happy to help you out. Okay, so any questions? No questions? Yeah. Well, hopefully, you know, I tried to keep it fairly restricted to one topic here, so I won't, you know, blow out too many brains. I'm trying to control myself in the brain frying department.
I appreciate that.
Okay, all right, awesome. Okay, so keep in mind, start off with the camera profile. Okay, that'll get you a starting point, and remember that as your starting point. You're going to build on that from there. Then what I do, and you can do it too until you find, you know, something that works better for you. I drop down to calibration, and I normally don't I don't ever mess with the red all that much. The green sometimes, but I find that blue slider, oh, that really adds something to a lot of images. So really investigate that, and you'll see that it's going to add a lot more drama to your images just by tweaking that, the saturation slider in the blue channel. Okay. Then I go ahead and go hit my Hue Saturation and Luminance. And then the last thing I might do, if at all, is the color grading. Okay? That's it.
Thank you, Doc.
Alrighty. Alright, guys. Like I said at the beginning, what we got coming up is the Beyond the Rule of Thirds. So if you're interested in learning more about composition, you know, go ahead and sign up for this. This, again, is through Milford Photo. So there is a fee attached to it. I think it's, it normally does, what, $24.95 or something, whatever it is. All right. If you go to Milford Photo's meetup page, you'll see the link there. Okay. Or actually, it's in my events page, so you can also get to it from my events page to their meetup page. Okay. Anyways, thank you guys ever so much for joining me. We'll see you next Monday for Photoshop. And if anybody's got any suggestions or a topic that you would like to see me cover in one of these episodes, feel free to shoot me a message and I'll try to work it in. Okay?
Well, I know you said you didn't do a lot of after photography, but if you could do something on processing LPwD shots, that would be awesome.
Okay. Well, that I need to be challenged too. So why not?
I agree. Thank you.
I need to be taken out of my. I need to be taken out of my comfort zone.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, guys. Thank you very much, and we'll catch you next time around.
Have a good night. Thank you.
All right, guys. You too.
Thank you for watching Learning Photography with Duck. Brought to you in association with Milford Photo, your local full-service camera store. Located in downtown Milford, Connecticut, Milford Photo offers you a personalized shopping experience. From the latest camera gear to printing and framing services. And, of course, educational workshops to teach you the finer aspects of photography. Don't forget to tell them Duck sent you.